At this very moment, somewhere in the ocean, a warship the size of a floating city may be carrying more than 5,000 sailors, dozens of aircraft, millions of pounds of fuel, and enough weapons to change the course of a war. It looks invincible. It costs billions. It is wrapped in steel, powered by some of the most advanced systems on Earth, and escorted by an entire strike group. But here is the terrifying truth. An aircraft carrier does not have to be defeated by a missile first. Sometimes, the most dangerous threat begins with a mistake, not a huge mistake. Not some Hollywood-sized catastrophe, just one failure in the first few seconds. One hatch left unsecured, one fire not isolated fast enough, one damaged space not sealed in time, one breakdown in watertight integrity that lets fire, smoke, fuel, or flooding spread. And once that happens, the clock starts, because the most dangerous mistake that can sink an aircraft carrier is not simply getting hit, it is failing to contain the damage immediately. That is what most people do not understand. On a carrier, the real battle starts after the impact, after the spark, after the explosion, after the first jet fuel fire hits the deck. In those first seconds, the ship is either turned into a series of isolated survivable compartments, or it begins to become one connected disaster, and that is exactly why this matters so much. Because aircraft carriers are not built like fantasy warships that just absorb damage forever. In fact, U.S. Navy compartmentation doctrine makes it clear that a ship's ability to resist sinking depends on compartmentation and watertight integrity. The same document warns that without those features, or without trained damage control teams, a severely damaged ship faces almost certain doom on carriers. That matters even more, because heavy armor is reduced to preserve speed, while compartmentation is increased to compensate. In other words, the carrier survives not just because it is big, but because damage is supposed to stay trapped where it starts. Now think about what that means in a real emergency. Imagine a crowded flight deck. Jets are armed, fuel hoses have been running. Bombs, missiles, rockets, and external tanks are all sitting only feet from one another. Engines are blasting hot exhaust across steel. The deck crew is operating in noise levels so intense that shouted warnings can vanish into the chaos. Everybody is moving quickly, because on a carrier, delay is danger. But speed also creates risk. And here is where it gets even more serious. The threat is not only the first fire. It is what the first fire touches next. If the initial casualty is isolated immediately, the ship may survive with damage. If it is not, fire can ignite fuel, heat ordnance, rupture tanks, sever hoses, blind crews with smoke, knock out firefighting systems, and open new paths for progressive flooding. That is the difference between a casualty and a catastrophe. The U.S. Navy has learned that lesson in blood. On July 29, 1967, aboard USS Forrestal, an electrical power surge caused a Zuni rocket to fire accidentally from an F-4 Phantom. That rocket slammed into a Skyhawk's external fuel tank, spilling fuel across the flight deck. That alone was already deadly. But then came the moment that changed everything. The fire heated nearby bombs. Just 1 minute and 36 seconds after the fire began, the first major bomb detonated in less than 5 minutes. Multiple bombs and warheads exploded in a chain reaction. The result was one of the worst carrier disasters in history. 134 dead, 161 injured, and massive destruction across the ship. Read that again, 1 minute and 36 seconds. That is how fast a crowded, fueled, armed flight deck can go from dangerous to hellish. You hear what happened next in Navy history. Because the Forrestal disaster was not the end of the lesson. Just 2 years later, on January 14, 1969, aboard USS Enterprise, another carrier fire nearly turned catastrophic. This time, the initial trigger was different, but the logic was the same. Exhaust from an aircraft start unit overheated a Zuni rocket. The rocket detonated, igniting JP-25 fuel. About 1 minute later, more Zunis exploded. About 3 minutes after the first blast, a bomb detonated and blew a hole in the flight deck. More bombs exploded after that. Burning fuel spread downward through holes in the deck to lower levels. Fire hoses were severed, foam systems were damaged. In total, there were 18 explosions, 8 holes blown through the flight deck, 28 dead and 314 injured. So what was the mistake? Was it the rocket, the exhaust, the placement of equipment? Partly, but at a deeper level. The lesson was the same as Forrestal. One localized emergency becomes life-threatening when it is allowed to spread. That is why the first seconds matter more than almost anything else, because the ship is still survivable while the damage is local. Once the casualty starts crossing boundaries, the fight becomes exponentially harder. And here is the part most civilians never see. Carriers fight this battle with something that sounds boring until your life depends on it. Watertight integrity, doors, hatches, scuttles, fittings, closure logs, condition settings. Dogs tightened correctly, passageways controlled, spaces sealed, material condition zebra. None of it looks cinematic. But that is the line between survival and sinking. Navy doctrine explains that watertight integrity can be reduced or destroyed not only by enemy action, but also by negligence. It warns that bad seals or compromised penetrations can create a path for progressive flooding. That phrase matters, progressive flooding, because ships rarely sink all at once. They die when water keeps moving, when one lost compartment becomes 3, then 5, then 10. Stability starts disappearing one mistake at a time. That is why every closure has a purpose. That is why every sailor drills. That is why damage control is called every sailor's responsibility, according to Naval History magazine. The two major elements of damage control are fighting fires and maintaining watertight integrity. Repair parties are spread throughout the ship to evaluate damage, stop leaks, and save the vessel under terrifying conditions. The reason is simple. Once thousands of gallons of water begin moving through the ship, nobody has time for confusion. The response has to be immediate, trained, and violent in its precision. And here is what makes carriers especially unforgiving. They are enormous, but they are not simple. Inside our aviation fuel systems, weapons magazines, and machinery spaces, a casualty can change character in seconds. A fire becomes smoke control. Smoke becomes electrical loss. Electrical loss becomes pump failure. Pump failure becomes flooding control failure. Flooding affects stability. Stability affects flight operations. Mission stops. And if the ship loses enough compartments or enough balance, survival itself becomes the mission. So when we say the most dangerous mistake, we are talking about this. Failing to isolate the casualty in the first moments. That can mean leaving the wrong closure open. It can mean delaying the setting of the right material condition. It can mean allowing fuel and fire to keep communicating with each other. It can mean not respecting ordnance cook-off times. It can mean one crew member assuming somebody else handled the safety step. It can mean one piece of equipment blowing hot exhaust in the wrong direction. It can mean one space not being sealed before water starts moving. And yes, sometimes it can be that small. History proves that aircraft carriers are tough, but history also proves they are only as survivable as the crew's ability to break the chain reaction before the ship's own size and complexity start working against it. Now, here is the good news. The US Navy knows this. That is why carriers train for damage control relentlessly. That is why material conditions like X-ray yoke and Zebra exist. That is why damage control central tracks closure stats. That is why repair lockers are spread across the ship. That is why crews rehearse floods, fires, toxic gas, battle damage, and mass casualty events until reaction becomes instinct. It is also why later incidents, while still dangerous, have often been contained better than they would have been in earlier decades. And that brings us to the real takeaway. People think the most dangerous thing on an aircraft carrier is the enemy missile, the torpedo, the storm, or the bomb. Those are deadly, but the most dangerous mistake is believing the ship is too big to die from a cascading internal failure, because the carrier does not lose when it gets hit. It loses when the damage stops being local. It loses when one compartment becomes a pathway. It loses when the crew cannot stop fire from reaching fuel, or flooding from reaching the next space, or smoke from blinding the response, or ordnance from reaching cook-off temperature. That is the nightmare, not the first explosion. The next one, and the one after that, and the moment the ship's internal boundaries fail to protect the rest of the ship. That is why watertight integrity is not bureaucracy, it is survival. That is why damage control is not backup work, it is warfare. And that is why some of the most heroic people on a carrier are not the ones launching the jets, but the ones racing into smoke, flame, ruptured steel, and flooding water to make sure the ship stays alive long enough to fight. Because if they fail, the ocean starts winning. Fast, much faster than most people think. So the next time you see a US aircraft carrier cutting through the sea like a floating fortress, remember this. Its greatest strength is not just its aircraft, its escorts, or even its size. Its greatest strength is the discipline that keeps one mistake from becoming a sinking, and once that discipline slips, even for seconds, one of the most powerful warships on Earth can find itself fighting for survival from the inside out.